Welcome to the World of Tanks Operation Think Tank 2012 here at the Military Vehicle Technology Foundation in Portola Valley, California. They're getting better at this.
Yeah. You've got a job there.
Right. Our Q&A panel, introductions first, starting on your left-hand side, Mr. Steve Zaloga. Mr. Harry Yeide. Mr. Hilary Doyle. Mr. David Fletcher, MBE. Mr. Rob Griffin. And Mr. Kenneth Estes. And those of you who don't know me, I am Nicholas, also known as the Chieftain for World of Tanks. So the way this is working, we had questions submitted from the internet and we have them in front of us. However, you've come all the way here, you have the right to ask a few questions yourself. So you should have paper and pen. So if, as we're chatting away, you come up with a question that you think is worthy of us, please fill out the question legibly. Put your name on the side so that we can actually call upon you. And then pass it to one side or the other side, and the questions will make their way up here, and I'll fit them in as I can. So might as well get started at the beginning. And this is a David question. We all know roughly where the word tank comes from, but I have a suspicion there's a bit more to the story. So why are tanks called tanks?
You want my version, Nicholas? Okay. Well, look, the original term, which was created by the British Admiralty, was land ships. And this was regarded as a wee bit obvious. Land ship? Yeah, I think we figure out what that is. There was a fellow who became secretary to the Land Ships Committee, name of Albert Stern. And they decided at this point that land ships being too obvious, they'd change it to something else, and they changed it to water carriers. Okay, I don't need to explain it. Anyhow, Albert realized, being a civilian, knowing the military propensity for initials, that he was soon to be secretary of the WC committee. Didn't appeal to him. Didn't appeal. He thought there'd be misunderstandings, and he reckons he selected the word tank as being something close to a water carrier. There are other claimants. I like Stern's story because it makes people laugh, which is the best reason for doing anything. But it's as good as any. And what they're looking for is something that identifies a metal box, basically. You know, the fact this metal box moves and shoots is immaterial. It's the fact of how it's made that got the word tank into the vocabulary in this sense. If you'd have spoken to somebody in 1914, 1915 and used the word tank, they would have said, okay, that's the thing up at the top of the house we keep water in, because the word had no other meaning. So it is literally a word taken out of context, peculiarly to the armoured fighting vehicle.
Okay, so let's move on to the development of the tank. Question submitted, was the development of the tank inhibited by the lack of a mode of motive power, i.e. the internal combustion engine? Was it the fact that you just had World War I that invented a tank, or was there a reason you couldn't have, say, steam-powered tanks?
Well, if you go back and you look at the early armored vehicles, you can't really look at them simply as tanks. If you look more broadly at armored vehicles, actually the first vehicles that are developed are armored cars and armored trains. And these days we kind of deprecate armored trains. They're obsolete, much as Zeppelins are. Zeppelins at one time were considered the primary means of bombardment, of aerial bombardment, yet they disappeared. And the train is the same way. There were armored trains much earlier than tanks. Armored trains can be certainly traced back as far as the American Civil War. They were very active in the Boer War. Armies had armored trains at the beginning of World War I. If you look at, for example, Russia had armored trains quite early on. Now, obviously, armored trains have limitations. They can only operate on rail. Armored trains were very effective. They had a lot of firepower, very good mobility. They were far more reliable than armored cars or that sort of thing. But of course, they had this mobility limitation. Armored cars were very common earlier on. There were armored cars driving around 1905, 1906, 1907. The limitation, of course, in armored cars is they have their own mobility restriction. They're pretty much restricted to roads. You could drive them on hard ground. If you happen to be operating on a battlefield that had hard ground, you could operate them. But when you start thinking of your archetypal World War I battlefield up in northern France or the Belgian frontier, of course you're starting to talk about soft soil and mud and things like that, so they don't work very well. So really what the issue is mobility becomes the key, and the mobility comes from the tracks. They already had powered armored vehicles before. They had trains, they had armored cars. You need the tracks. And so the key ingredient is that somebody thinks, aha, we have these agricultural tractors, we could take that technology and that would give us mobility. But there's some strange variations. If you go and look, for example, at the French come up with what's called the Boireau device. And it would be hard to show here, we don't have any pictures, but the Boireau device was about as big as this room. It consisted of large metal frames, sort of like picture frames, all hinged to make a big circle. Then you put a steam engine in the middle, and you go clump, 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 clump around the battlefield. It is a sort of tank. It's certainly not a tank to our way of thinking, but it was an early solution to this mobility problem of moving across terrain. So there were predecessors to the tank, and probably the key ingredient was this brilliant insight that by taking the agricultural technology of tractors with track devices, which are of course designed to move in fields, and apply that to armored vehicles, that you get tanks from it. And that's why tanks do not appear only in Britain, although Britain was the first to use tanks. The concept appears in several countries. It's just that Britain comes out first with a practical device that's actually put on the battlefield.
So the tank is now in production. Of course, it really came into its own with the whole blitzkrieg idea and mobile command arms warfare. And the two names that are most commonly associated with this are Liddel-Hart and Guderian. So, I mean, just how much input did they have on how tanks are used today?
It depends who you ask. Now, you ask Liddel-Hart or Guderian, and they will tell you exactly how much input they had. Probably asking us, not such a good idea, but...
There's no evidence that Guderian had very much real influence.
I don't think there was with Liddel-Hart either. Liddel-Hart thought he did. Liddel-Hart thought he influenced everybody. Whether he really did, he was a disciple of Fuller to some extent, and Fuller was a crazy man anyhow. Whether that's any recommendation or not, who says?
Well, a couple of other names ought to be thrown out. I mean, I think that we threw in Liddel-Hart and Guderian because they were such self-serving, egocentric characters. But it has kind of come through the literature that these two people were very influential. The problem is that a lot of lesser-known characters were really quite important, and their names are almost entirely unknown. Certainly in the Western European side, I would argue that probably the most influential was General Estienne in France. He was the one who pushed French tanks, and we kind of dismiss French tanks these days, but in World War I, there were far more French tanks than anywhere else. I mean, Britain certainly saw as much combat action, but the French probably actually numerically built a few more tanks. And Estienne came up with many of the critical innovations. He was the one behind the Renault FT, which is the predecessor of modern tanks as far as layout is concerned, but also in terms of doctrine. He was the one who came up with what he called the bee-swarm idea. Instead of having these very large land ships, you'd build large numbers of very small vehicles that would swarm all over the battlefield and overwhelm the enemy, because there was a real problem in 1918. Once people understood the threat of the tank, they started coming up with antidotes, whether it was mines or anti-tank guns. He came up with the idea that, yeah, sooner or later, if you only have a handful of tanks, you will be stopped. But if you can come up with hundreds of small tanks, you can swarm over the battlefield. And in some ways, this can be regarded as the forerunner to blitzkrieg. And of course, on the Russian side, what we forget is that from the end of the First World War, from 1918 till the beginning of the Second World War, 1939, the folks who built the most tanks were the Russians. And so obviously there's something going on there. What was going on there is that the Russians and the other countries that fought against the Bolsheviks, fighting in a vast open area, mobility is obviously key, a lot of armored cars, a lot of armored trains, and actually a significant number of tanks. Russia sees the value of tanks and just builds them in enormous numbers. The most widely produced tanks of the 1920s and 1930s were built in Russia. So there's many names that can be mentioned connected with tanks in Russia. Tukhachevsky is obviously the most obvious, but there were many other key players. But I think that the reason that we hear Liddel-Hart, we can understand why we hear him, because he wrote in English. So all of us speak English, so we know him. Guderian, because in 1955, Panzer Leader comes out in English in Ballantine paperback. If you're like me, that was one of the first tank books I ever read, so we all know Guderian. Estienne's books never came out in English. Tukhachevsky's books, maybe they've come out since. So we know the stuff that appears in the English language, but we don't know the stuff that appears elsewhere.
On the German side, there was General Lutz was Guderian's boss, but he got purged. So you never hear anything about him from a political point of view. But he was the guy who was actually generating the requirements for mobile warfare. But what's often forgotten is that the Germans and the Russians were working very close together, and the Germans had a test station in Russia where they were testing the various different ideas, and their original Großtraktor, Leichtetraktor and so forth were worked on in Russia, and that's where they realized they wanted to change the turret designs, go for more crew in the turrets and stuff like that.
And I'd add, on the American side, you have to think about George Patton, because he inherited equipment that the French had built for this swarm idea, and we had no doctrine for tanks, so he had to write one, and he wrote one that fit the equipment he had at hand. And even though once the war was over and the infantry got control of tank development in the United States, and he went back to the horse cavalry, the doctrine that he set out was the doctrine that was practiced, and it had such momentum that I think it deeply influenced the development of tank models, what I call the cult of the machine gun. We built some pretty ridiculous things up until we realized that there was going to be tank-on-tank warfare. The cavalry started getting into the tank business a little bit, and his doctrine really was the heart of tank infantry doctrine at the beginning of the Second World War.
And there's one little detail to add to Patton. It's quite curious that there were two significant tank officers in the U.S. Army in World War I, and Patton is certainly the best known. The other one was Dwight Eisenhower. Yeah. Dwight Eisenhower was over on this side of the pond when Patton was over in France. He was responsible for training tank crews. And at Fort George Meade, after the war, when the tank corps exists for a short period of time before it's disbanded, the two next door neighbors are George Patton and Dwight Eisenhower. And they're both basically warned off from a career standpoint once the tank corps is disbanded, but they both go on to bigger and better things. But Eisenhower certainly had a fine appreciation of tank warfare from his early association early in his career.
Well, oh, sorry, go on.
The German-Russian collaboration in the late 20s and early 30s was, of course, an attempt to escape the Versailles Treaty limitations. Germany, the great practitioner of Blitzkrieg, was prohibited from having tanks under Versailles. Yet, what will later be popularized as the Blitzkrieg has its foundation under General Zeke, the chief of the staff, in the 1920s in the form of fast troops. The Germans have enemies on all frontiers. They're limited to a 100,000-man army. The army they have must therefore be somehow tactically superior to the outnumbering armies it faces. Therefore, rapid mobility becomes the keynote of the German army, and firepower at a time when there's no tanks. They're trying to improve the infantry, the speed of deployment, and the firepower. So they're already thinking mobility before they even have the machines. So the doctrine in that case preceded the machines.
Okay, moving on then, back to since you brought up Patton, I just want to take the 5 seconds it is required to publicly refer to the Belton-Cooper claim that the reason the M26 Pershing was not used as a standard D-Day tank was because General Patton did not like it. Can we all have a nice round agreement that this is not the case?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you want
Bollocks.
Do we want an explanation there?
Why not?
There's one name that folks here may recognize and may not, is General Bruce Clark. Clark was a combat commander originally in 4th Armored Division, later in 7th Armored Division, and one of the best tank officers in the U.S. Army during World War II. Not particularly well known, but certainly well known at the time. And Bruce Clark in his memoirs referred to George Patton as knowing less about tanks than any general that he ever knew. And what he meant by that was not the tactical application of tanks. He did not he was not trying to dismiss Patton as a fine tank technician. He was trying to make the point that George Patton knew nothing mechanically about tanks. And in fact, years ago, I was writing a book on the history of the French Renault FT, and I was going through the U.S. Army records to see what there was on the U.S. side, because the U.S. Army relied on the Renault FT. And there were several documents by George Patton making suggestions back to U.S. Army Ordnance about what they should do to the Renault FT to improve it. And it was all complete crap. It was awful stuff. And in subsequent years, I found similar things during the course of World War II in 1944-45, where he sent notes back. And getting back to what Harry was saying about the cult of the machine gun, it always involved the machine gun. He wanted to put lots and lots more machine guns on the tanks. And they were usually very silly. It was like, oh, we need another 2 in the back and another 2 in the front, and all just awful ideas. But the real point is, aside from the fact that Patton was just not that familiar with the technical aspects of tanks, the mechanical or the design aspects, field generals don't have any influence or have very, very little influence on tank development. Everybody seems to think that that's the case. It is not. The Ordnance Branch or whoever in various other armies designs tanks, they will sometimes send out, in the case of the U.S. Army, it was called the New Weapons Board, they would send people out in the field and talk to people and say, well, what would you like in a tank? But by that stage, Ordnance has pretty much decided what they're going to do anyways, and it's really a choice of A or B. They will oftentimes go out in the field, and they did this during World War II, and they said, here's our options. We've come up with these pilot model tanks. What do you like? And so the choice is between a handful of things. But it's not a case of where George Patton or General Hodges or any other field army commanders have any direct detail. And the Belton Cooper thing, although it's repeated often, is complete nonsense. I've gone through a lot of the records on the development of the Pershing tank on the M26. There's no evidence that Patton had any influence at all, absolutely zero.
Okay, now that I think we've thoroughly discredited that idea. No offense if Mr. Cooper is watching this, but...
From heaven.
Oh, is he dead?
Yes.
Oh. Sorry.
I actually got involved in tanks from the hobby side. I've been an avid modeler since I was young. I used to build model aircraft when I was young. And eventually I got into building model tanks because I particularly like doing small detail work. And tanks are simply a lot more intricate than airplanes are. And I had a good deal of success with the tank models, and that inspired the interest in the history. I was already interested in military history in general, but it went from being general military history to the specifics of tanks and tank technology and the use of tanks in combat and that sort of thing. So by the time I got to college, I was a fairly avid researcher on tank history. And it was an interesting period to be involved in tank research because at that time, we're talking late 1960s, early 1970s, there wasn't much in print. So it took quite a bit of work to dig it out. The town that I grew up in had a National Guard unit, and the National Guard unit happened to be a tank battalion. And for a period of time, for a few years, they went and parked their M48 Pattons out in a big open field. And being mischievous 8-year-olds or 9-year-olds or however old we were at the time, we figured out how to get past the padlocks that they had on the hatches to prevent people from getting inside. So during the summer, we'd sneak inside and go and play with the tanks and swivel a turret around and things like that. So that was probably my first personal contact with tanks. I started writing books about tanks partly because my academic background was in history, and as an historian, the product of your work is generally writing, and so it naturally spilled over into my hobby interest in tanks. And also because when I was doing the research in tanks, I was collecting more and more material, and it was interesting to me, and I figured that it would be interesting to other people as well. So I started writing magazine articles. I wrote for a Canadian-based magazine called AFE News. That was my first writing experience. Very good writing experience before books. First of all, it gives me credibility with publishers in the sense they see that I have an extensive array of articles that I've written. So they see that I know the subject matter, that I can write, that I know how to present the material. So it was actually a pretty easy leap between writing articles and then writing books. It's very difficult to jump into books if you don't have some kind of track record having written other stuff. And the magazines that I was writing for, I really wasn't getting paid for. They were volunteer magazines, so I could sort of learn by experience, and that's how I got involved in the writing business. It would certainly be the Russian T-34, and it's partly because I developed my reputation as a writer writing about Russian tanks. And actually, my first book was in the T-34. My first book on the T-34 was not published. It was done for a British publisher, which collapsed shortly after I finished the book. But I retained interest in the subject, and I sort of brought the material up to date, and it ended up being my second book. I did one for Squadron Signal, an American-based publisher. And so that still clings to my mind as being, you know, probably my primary area of interest. But then in later years, I've moved away from writing extensively on Russian subjects, and the reason is, back in the day, in the 1970s, 1980s, there was very little available on Russian tanks, not only in the United States and Britain, but also in Russia. For security reasons, they wrote very, very little on tanks. Since the fall of the Soviet Union and the growth of contemporary Russia, attitudes have changed, and there's a great deal of material coming out in Russian right now in Russia. And the Russian researchers are doing an extremely good job. There's many fine new books from Russia on Russian tanks. They have far better material and far better sources than I do. So I've backed off, and I'm going back now and doing more work on U.S. Army tanks, which had always been one of my core interests in the past anyways, so I'm happy to do that. But I have sort of made a decision to move away from that subject area. Oh yeah, by now I've written somewhere over 150 books. I don't only write on tanks. I'm probably best known as a tank writer, but my background is in modern European history, and so the areas that I write in are a bit broader. I like, at the moment I must say, rather than tank books, I still enjoy writing tank books, but I write campaign histories for Osprey Publishing in Britain. I really enjoy doing the campaign books. They involve a certain amount of stuff on the weapons and the tanks and other weapons, but they're a broader view of combat. And then there's some other areas that I've sort of specialized in at various points in time. I've written a fair amount of books on modern fortifications, the German Atlantic Wall, the Westfall, other World War II fortification lines, that sort of thing. So there are other subject areas. I don't confine it to tanks, but I certainly retain a core interest in writing on tanks.